Karoline Leavitt stood tall in the press room, a sharp contrast to the political landscape that she had found herself thrust into. As a rising conservative star, she had spent the last few years honing her skills in the media and political arenas, and today was her moment to take center stage. Her gaze was steady, and her expression was calm, but there was an intensity behind her eyes that showed she was ready for what lay ahead. Across from her, the cameras rolled, capturing every moment, every word. The stakes were high. This wasn't just another political briefing. It was an opportunity for Leavitt to challenge one of the most outspoken and controversial figures in Congress, Ilhan Omar. Leavitt had been invited to this press conference to speak about the issue that had been dominating conservative discourse for months: the unchecked power of politicians like Ilhan Omar. Omar, a member of the House of Representatives, had become the subject of intense scrutiny for her outspoken views and controversial actions. For Leavitt, it wasn't just about criticizing a political opponent. It was about exposing what she saw as the hypocrisy and manipulation at the heart of Washington's political establishment. Omar had long been a thorn in the side of conservatives, but Leavitt was ready to take on the challenge head-on. The press room was packed with journalists from various media outlets, some of them already skeptical of Leavitt's reputation as a rising conservative figure. They knew her as a political strategist, a skilled communicator, but few had seen her in a setting like this, an intense back-and-forth in front of cameras, under the unforgiving gaze of the public. This was her test, and she was determined not to let it slip by. As the briefing began, Leavitt could feel the weight of the moment. The energy in the room shifted as she prepared to speak, knowing that her words would be analyzed, dissected, and picked apart. Leavitt wasted no time. She began by framing the conversation, directly addressing the issue that had sparked this heated debate: Ilhan Omar's divisive rhetoric and actions. Her voice was firm but measured, as she outlined the concerns many Americans had about Omar's political agenda. "I stand here today," she began, "not just as a representative of my constituents, but as a voice for those who feel their concerns are being ignored by the political elites in Washington. Ilhan Omar has built her career on undermining American values and questioning the integrity of our institutions." The room grew quiet. Leavitt's words hit hard, and the journalists were all ears. She continued, laying out the facts, pointing to Omar's controversial comments on various issues, from national security to her support for extreme policies that many considered radical. Leavitt didn't just criticize her opponent's views, she presented a detailed, fact-based argument that framed Omar as a symbol of the very problems that had come to define the political left: a lack of accountability, a disdain for American traditions, and an over-reliance on identity politics. The tension in the room was palpable, as the reporters knew this was not going to be a typical briefing. Leavitt was not here to make polite, politically correct statements. She was here to challenge the narrative, to hold Omar accountable. She pointed to specific instances where Omar had defended the actions of extremist groups, where her comments had raised questions about her loyalty to the United States, and where her policies directly contradicted the principles of freedom and democracy. Omar had always been a lightning rod for controversy, and Leavitt's words were sharp, calculated. She spoke not only to the journalists in the room but also to the millions watching from their screens. She was speaking to those who felt disillusioned by the political class, those who wanted a leader who would take action, not just talk about it. Leavitt wasn't just criticizing Omar for the sake of it, she was laying the groundwork for a broader critique of the current political system, one that had been dominated by individuals who, in her view, had lost touch with the American people. As Leavitt spoke, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The usual politeness of the press conferences had faded, replaced by an edge of curiosity and skepticism. The room was no longer just watching, they were listening, considering her words. Leavitt didn't waste time on unnecessary pleasantries. She went straight to the heart of the matter, challenging the premise of the debate. "It's not just about policy disagreements," she said. "It's about the very nature of the politics that are being played in Washington. People like Ilhan Omar don't want to engage in meaningful discussions. They want to push an agenda that divides, that diminishes the value of our democracy." It was then that the confrontation began to escalate. Leavitt had made her case, but she knew it wasn't enough. She had to keep the pressure on. As she finished her statement, she turned her gaze toward the press and waited. The tension was thick in the room, and it was clear that this was not going to be a one-sided affair. The journalists, many of whom had their own opinions about Omar, began to ask pointed questions, attempting to pin Leavitt down on the specifics of her claims. But Leavitt remained unflinching, countering every question with precision and confidence. She was in control now. As the press conference continued, Leavitt's responses became more direct, more pointed. She had made her initial case, but now it was time to drive the point home. She wasn't here to just answer questions, she was here to challenge the status quo. And as the session moved forward, it became clear that this wouldn't be just another ordinary briefing. This was the beginning of a new phase in the political conversation, one where Leavitt's voice would be heard, and her message would resonate far beyond the confines of this room. The moment the press conference hit its stride, the tension between Karoline Leavitt and Ilhan Omar had reached an electrifying peak. Leavitt had already laid out her stance. Omar's divisive rhetoric, unchecked extremism, and radical policies were not just issues of political disagreement. They were fundamentally dangerous for the country. As Leavitt continued her criticism, her delivery became more polished, but her voice maintained a sharp edge that matched the intensity of her words. Omar, seated across from her, had remained mostly silent during Leavitt's opening statement, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. The world knew her as a staunch progressive, a congresswoman with the ability to speak powerfully on behalf of marginalized communities. But in this moment, in the spotlight of Leavitt's direct confrontation, Omar's usually commanding presence seemed to falter. Leavitt could see the tension in her opponent's face, though she didn't let it show in her own demeanor. She had carefully prepared for this moment, and the pressure didn't faze her. As Leavitt transitioned to more specific examples of Omar's controversial remarks and actions, the tension in the room was palpable. The audience, mostly journalists accustomed to political showdowns, sensed this wasn't going to be an ordinary press briefing. Leavitt wasn't interested in playing by the typical rules of decorum. She went straight for the jugular, highlighting Omar's troubling alliances and speaking to her history of making statements that many viewed as undermining national security. She was laser-focused on presenting facts, giving the press everything they needed to see Omar in a new, more vulnerable light. Leavitt emphasized the way Omar had defended extremist groups, citing her statements and actions that, according to Leavitt, painted her as someone out of touch with the very values that America was founded on. She pointed to Omar's criticism of U.S. foreign policy, arguing that her comments about 9/11 and the actions of terrorist organizations were not only insensitive but dangerously misguided. Leavitt's words cut through the air like a sharp knife, calm, but forceful. She wasn't just exposing Omar's political stance, she was challenging her moral compass, questioning her loyalty to the very country that had allowed her to rise to power. The press room, once filled with the usual buzz of background chatter, had quieted down, and all eyes were now on Leavitt. The journalists, who had likely come expecting another ordinary back and forth between two opposing sides, were now witnessing something far more compelling. Leavitt wasn't just criticizing Omar's politics, she was taking aim at the core of what Omar represented, an ideology that Leavitt believed had no place in the future of America. But Leavitt knew the battle wasn't over yet. She could see that Omar was starting to bristle, her fingers tapping lightly against the table as if to maintain control. The silence that had followed Leavitt's direct accusations felt thick, almost suffocating. Leavitt had her opponent on the ropes, but she wasn't going to let up. This was the moment where she could shift the narrative completely. She was no longer just speaking to the press or her supporters, she was speaking to the American people, and she knew the weight of her words. Omar, finally breaking her silence, leaned forward and launched into a defense of her record, but Leavitt wasn't intimidated. As Omar began to explain her positions, Leavitt's expression remained stoic, her mind whirring with the next step in the conversation. She was ready for this. The last thing she wanted was to get caught in an ideological back and forth. Instead, Leavitt deflected Omar's arguments with swift, factual counterpoints that exposed the inconsistency in her reasoning. Leavitt spoke calmly, making her case with the precision of a surgeon. Every word was calculated. She didn't raise her voice or become emotional, which only made her words feel all the more impactful. The back and forth continued, but now Leavitt had the upper hand. Omar's defenses were growing weaker as Leavitt continued to poke holes in her arguments, systematically dismantling them with ease. Every time Omar tried to redirect the conversation, Leavitt brought it back to the central issue: accountability. She wasn't asking for a confrontation, she was demanding a reckoning. She challenged Omar's authority, questioning how she could stand by her statements when they seemed so fundamentally at odds with the values of the American people. It was a masterclass in political sparring. Leavitt was calm, focused, and relentless. The tension in the room began to build once more, with Leavitt refusing to let up. She called out Omar's inconsistencies, highlighted her failure to answer to the very people who elected her, and demanded that she face the truth of her own contradictions. As the press conference wore on, Leavitt began to push harder, not just for her own victory but for a larger victory for all Americans who believed in honesty, integrity, and accountability. Omar, who had initially been dismissive of Leavitt's words, now found herself backpedaling. Her arguments became more fragmented as Leavitt's steady, unyielding approach made it impossible for Omar to maintain her composure. The press, who had initially been on the fence about the exchange, began to shift their focus entirely onto Leavitt's points. Her confidence was undeniable, her delivery unshakable. She had won over the room without raising her voice, and it was clear that she had made her mark in the most important battle of her political career. In the final moments of the briefing, Leavitt turned to Omar one last time. "Would you like to clarify anything?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the weight of the moment. It was the kind of question that demanded an answer. And as Omar sat back, looking flustered and unsure, Leavitt knew that she had done more than win a political argument. She had set the stage for a movement, one that called for transparency, truth, and a renewed commitment to American values. As the press conference ended and Leavitt walked away from the podium, she knew this was just the beginning. The battle had been hard fought, but she had made her point, and she had made it clear she wasn't backing down. As the press conference reached its third hour, the tension in the room was palpable. Karoline Leavitt's sharp, calculated attacks on Ilhan Omar had left the liberal congresswoman visibly rattled. What had started as a seemingly typical exchange of political rhetoric had quickly escalated into something far more consequential. Leavitt had entered the arena with a clear goal: to challenge Omar's record, expose contradictions, and make the case that she was not only unfit to represent her district but also a dangerous figure in American politics. And so far, she had done just that. Omar, once the darling of the progressive left, found herself on the defensive. Every answer she gave seemed weaker than the last. The audience, both in the room and watching from afar, could sense that something had shifted. Leavitt's confidence had never wavered, her words more powerful than ever. She didn't need to shout or become combative. Instead, she relied on precision, facts, and a calm demeanor that made every word she spoke land with force. The questions kept coming, but Leavitt had already seized the initiative. She continued to draw attention to Omar's extreme positions, highlighting the congresswoman's history of defending controversial movements and organizations. She wasn't simply attacking her for being a political opponent. She was exposing what she viewed as a profound disconnect between Omar's rhetoric and the values that most Americans held dear. Leavitt's criticisms weren't just personal, they were moral and ideological. She pointed out how Omar had used her platform to spread divisive narratives that threatened to undermine the unity of the country. Omar, meanwhile, struggled to respond with any real substance. She made vague references to fighting for the disenfranchised, to standing up for the oppressed, but her words lacked the weight of real solutions. Leavitt kept the pressure on, asking pointed questions about Omar's public statements regarding national security. She demanded to know why Omar had expressed such deep skepticism about the role of the United States on the world stage. She challenged Omar on her past remarks about 9/11, reminding the room of the congresswoman's controversial comments that many viewed as dismissive of the terrorist attacks. Leavitt knew that this issue was a touchstone for many Americans, especially those who had lived through the tragedy and its aftermath. Omar's response was weak, a mixture of deflections and attempts to steer the conversation in a different direction. But Leavitt wasn't having it. She kept bringing it back to the same central point: Omar's inability to acknowledge the complexities of international relations and the threat posed by extremist ideologies. Leavitt wasn't just questioning her opponent's policies, she was questioning her character, her values, and her understanding of what it meant to represent the American people. As she spoke, Leavitt made it clear that Omar's perspective was not just wrong, it was dangerous. The room was hanging on her every word, and it became increasingly clear that Leavitt was not just playing the role of a political challenger, but also of a defender of American values. Omar, to her credit, wasn't backing down entirely. She tried to shift the conversation to broader social issues, attempting to reframe the debate as one about inequality and systemic oppression. But Leavitt was unrelenting. She reminded Omar that, as a representative, her job was to balance these concerns with the security and prosperity of the nation as a whole. She pointed out that while it was important to address domestic inequalities, it was equally crucial to ensure that the U.S. remained strong and unified in the face of global threats. Omar, however, continued to focus on her ideological stance, which only made her seem more entrenched in a worldview that many in the room found increasingly disconnected from reality. At this point, the media in the room began to shift their focus entirely. It wasn't just a debate anymore, it was an interrogation. Leavitt had masterfully turned the tables on Omar, making her the one who had to justify her policies, her statements, and her approach to governance. The more she spoke, the more it became evident that Omar was not prepared to defend her record under scrutiny. Every time she tried to shift the conversation, Leavitt deftly redirected it, pressing her further into a corner. The room was filled with a mixture of tension and awe as Leavitt's sharp critiques continued to land. Her words had weight, and they were resonating with the audience in a way that Omar's had not. It was becoming clear that Leavitt was not just winning the exchange, she was making Omar's position untenable. What had started as a debate was quickly evolving into an ideological reckoning. Omar, realizing she was losing ground, began to falter. Her usual confidence was nowhere to be found, replaced by a look of frustration that she tried, but failed, to conceal. She had underestimated Leavitt. What she had thought would be a straightforward discussion of policies and ideas had turned into a public dismantling of her political career. The dynamic had shifted, and now the spotlight was squarely on Omar. The media had begun to focus less on her rebuttals and more on her inability to answer Leavitt's pointed questions. As the press conference drew to a close, it was clear that Leavitt had not only successfully exposed Omar's vulnerabilities, but had also redefined the narrative. What had been billed as a simple political exchange had become a moment of profound consequence. Leavitt had taken down one of the left's most vocal voices with precision and poise. This was just the beginning for Karoline Leavitt. Her words had sparked a fire, and she knew that the effects of this press conference would reverberate long after the cameras stopped rolling. She had made her mark, and the political world was watching. As the press conference continued, the dynamic had completely shifted. The cameras were no longer simply capturing the exchange. They were recording a moment of political history, one that would likely ripple across the media landscape. Karoline Leavitt had succeeded in doing something few thought possible. She had taken control of the conversation, turning the spotlight on Ilhan Omar, and doing so with precision and relentless confidence. With every new question she asked, Leavitt seemed to inch closer to the truth, challenging not just Omar's political stance, but her credibility. The tension in the room was palpable. Journalists were leaning forward, eager to see how Omar would respond to Leavitt's latest accusations. In contrast, Leavitt remained calm, her demeanor unshaken. She wasn't just here to challenge Omar's policies. She was making it clear that there was a moral and ethical case to be made against her opponent's position. She had effectively framed Omar as a representative of a political movement that, in Leavitt's view, was out of touch with the values that Americans held dear. And now, with every word, Leavitt seemed to be solidifying her argument. Omar's responses were becoming increasingly defensive, but Leavitt wasn't giving her any room to backpedal. Every time Omar tried to redirect the conversation, Leavitt skillfully brought it back to the central issues: Omar's inability to balance the demands of social justice with the necessity of protecting national security. Omar's refusal to accept the reality of Islamic extremism as a global threat was a point Leavitt hammered home. She wasn't just attacking Omar's policies, she was calling into question her worldview, which seemed to dismiss the very real dangers facing the country. The room began to buzz with whispers. Journalists, who had been passive observers moments before, were now fully engaged. The exchange had gone from a political debate to something much more profound: a clash of ideologies, a confrontation between those who believed in a more global, progressive vision and those who thought that vision was not only misguided but dangerous. Leavitt's strategy had been clear from the start: she wasn't interested in simply winning a debate. She wanted to redefine the terms of the conversation. And as she continued to dismantle Omar's arguments, it became clear that Leavitt was not just participating in the debate, she was reshaping it. She would no longer allow Omar's rhetoric about victimhood and identity politics to dominate the discussion. Leavitt had shifted the focus back onto the practical concerns of American voters: security, national unity, and the ability of the United States to maintain its standing in the world. Omar, now visibly flustered, started to resort to the kind of tactics that Leavitt had anticipated. She began to accuse Leavitt of playing political games, of twisting the truth, of undermining the progressive agenda in order to score points. But Leavitt wasn't rattled. She had anticipated these kinds of retorts, and she knew exactly how to handle them. Every time Omar accused her of misrepresentation, Leavitt calmly responded with a fact or a quote, pointing out the inconsistencies in Omar's own statements. At one point, Leavitt addressed the central issue that had defined this entire exchange: the question of loyalty to the United States. It was a loaded topic, one that Omar had never fully addressed in public. Leavitt asked her, point blank, why she had not been more outspoken about the dangers of terrorism and the rise of groups like ISIS and Hamas. She pressed Omar on her remarks about the U.S. military, suggesting that Omar's tendency to criticize American actions abroad was undermining the country's global position. Omar stammered, but Leavitt didn't give her the chance to regroup. She asked again, this time more pointedly, why do you defend regimes and ideologies that threaten not only the safety of the United States but the safety of our allies? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Omar faltered, offering a vague response that only seemed to expose her discomfort with the question. Leavitt seized the opportunity, saying, "You talk about fighting for justice, but how can we have justice if we don't have security? How can we help the oppressed if we don't first protect our own people?" For the first time during the press conference, Omar seemed to lose her composure. Her face tightened, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was clear she had not expected the conversation to take this turn. She had hoped to steer the debate into familiar, comfortable territory about civil rights and inequality, but Leavitt had masterfully shifted the discussion toward issues of national security and American sovereignty, topics that were always going to be harder for Omar to defend. At this point, it wasn't just the press and the public who were watching closely, it was also her fellow politicians. Leavitt's questions were not just aimed at Omar, they were aimed at the entire progressive movement. By attacking Omar's positions on foreign policy, Leavitt was opening up a broader conversation about the direction the left had taken over the past few years. She wasn't simply questioning one congresswoman's views, she was questioning the entire framework of progressivism, particularly when it came to issues of national security and foreign policy. The clock on the wall ticked down, but neither Leavitt nor Omar showed any sign of backing down. By this point, Leavitt had delivered a crushing blow to Omar's narrative, and as the session came to a close, she delivered her final statement with unflinching resolve. "You can continue to push your narrative," Leavitt said, addressing the room, "but it's clear that what you're really doing is undermining the principles this country was built on." The room was silent for a moment. The journalists were in awe of Leavitt's performance, and many in the room could sense that this was not just a typical political confrontation. This was a moment where the status quo had been challenged, and the battle lines had been drawn. The media would be talking about this exchange for days, and Leavitt had made sure that the narrative would be hers to control. As she left the stage, she knew that she had not just made her point. She had made a statement. And the political world, already watching closely, would now be forced to reckon with the ideas she had laid bare. The press conference ended, but the aftermath was just beginning. Karoline Leavitt knew that she had delivered a powerful blow to Ilhan Omar's political image, but the true impact of her words wouldn't be measured in the moment. The real test lay in how the media, the public, and her political opponents would respond. As she exited the stage, the room buzzed with energy, a mix of astonishment and quiet admiration. Journalists quickly turned their attention to the screens, reviewing the footage of Leavitt's confident, calculated performance. It had been more than a debate, it had been a masterclass in political discourse. Leavitt had said what so many conservatives had been thinking but hadn't been able to articulate as effectively: that Omar's rhetoric wasn't just divisive, it was dangerous. The Congresswoman's failure to reckon with the implications of her positions, particularly regarding foreign policy and national security, had now been laid bare for all to see. Leavitt had deftly exposed the contradictions in Omar's arguments, pointing out how her views undermined American interests and the safety of the nation. It was a devastating critique, one that made it difficult for Omar to walk away with any semblance of dignity. As Leavitt moved through the halls of the press conference venue, she was met with nods of acknowledgement from fellow political figures, some of whom had been silently rooting for her success. They had witnessed the quiet storm she had unleashed on Omar. Though she was still relatively young and new to the national stage, Leavitt had proven that she could stand toe-to-toe with one of the left's most prominent voices. The victory wasn't just a win for her personally, it was a statement to the entire political establishment that the tides of political discourse were shifting. Back at the White House, the media storm had already begun. Clips of Leavitt's performance were circulating across social media, with hashtags like #LeavittCrushesOmar and #OmarUnderFire trending nationwide. Conservatives on Twitter, eager to capitalize on Leavitt's success, were quick to praise her for exposing Omar's weaknesses. They were framing this moment as a turning point for the conservative movement, an example of a young, fresh face successfully taking on the entrenched political elites. The optics were clear. Leavitt had not only held her own but had effectively dismantled the left's narrative. On the other side, Omar's camp scrambled to control the damage. Her spokesperson issued a statement accusing Leavitt of misleading the public and distorting facts to score political points. But the damage was done. The media, including some left-leaning outlets, began picking apart Omar's responses, noting the discomfort and defensiveness in her voice as Leavitt pressed her on her record. The juxtaposition of Leavitt's calm, methodical delivery against Omar's increasingly rattled responses made the Congresswoman appear weak and unprepared for the tough questions she faced. In the days following the press conference, Leavitt's profile surged. She was invited to speak on numerous conservative talk shows, where her calm demeanor and confident articulation continued to impress. She didn't shy away from the attention, rather, she embraced it, knowing that she had struck a chord with Americans who were fed up with the political games being played by figures like Omar. While many conservatives rallied behind her, praising her for standing up to what they saw as a dangerous and radical left-wing agenda, Leavitt remained focused on the issues. She refused to get bogged down in the drama. Instead, she steered the conversation back to the real substance: the protection of American values, national security, and the fight against extremism. As the weeks went by, Leavitt's influence continued to grow. Her ability to challenge Omar's ideas and expose the flaws in her arguments had propelled her into the national spotlight. But Leavitt understood that this was just the beginning. The political battle she had started wasn't just a personal victory for her, it was part of a larger movement. Conservatives were hungry for leaders who were unafraid to challenge the left, and Leavitt had shown that she was willing to take on even the most entrenched figures in the political establishment. For Leavitt, the experience had been a confirmation of her instincts and abilities. It wasn't enough to simply follow in the footsteps of others in her party. If she was going to be a voice for change, she had to be bold, direct, and willing to fight for what she believed in. And, as the weeks went on, it became clear that her approach was resonating with a wide audience, both in the political world and among ordinary Americans who were tired of the status quo. Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar, once a rising star on the progressive left, faced an uphill battle to regain her footing. Her approval ratings began to slip as more and more people began questioning her positions and her approach to governance. The pressure was mounting, and her response to Leavitt's criticisms was proving to be insufficient. Omar, who had once been hailed as a champion for marginalized communities, now found herself cornered, trying to justify her actions in the face of mounting opposition. The public was no longer willing to overlook her contradictions, and the weight of Leavitt's questions would linger in the minds of voters. Leavitt, however, was undeterred. She knew that the fight wasn't over. The attention she had gained was just the start of a much larger battle, one where the future of American politics would be decided not just by policy, but by the ability of leaders like her to confront uncomfortable truths and stand firm in the face of adversity. As she looked forward, she understood the importance of continuing to push the conversation forward, of staying true to her values, and of building a movement that could push back against the forces that sought to divide the country. The victory against Omar was just one chapter in a much larger story. And for Karoline Leavitt, the story was just beginning.